Well, the Gein family moved to Plainfield from La Crosse, Wisconsin, partly because the mother of the family, the matriarch, Augusta, had decided that La Crosse was a kind of Sodom and Gomorrah-like hellhole, and she didn't want her children to be corrupted by all the immoral influences of the big city. Needless to say, La Crosse was not a particularly big city, but they moved to a remote farmhouse about 6 miles west of, you wouldn't necessarily say downtown Plainfield because there was no uptown Plainfield.
It's not the largest city in the state of Wisconsin, but it's plenty big enough for those of us that live here.
Plainfield was a very remote, isolated, featureless little village. A state guidebook at the time described it as totally nondescript. The population was very small, never more in its history, I think, than 700 or 800 people. You know, probably the entire population of the village could have fit into a New York City apartment building.
The Gein's 150-acre farm was located on the corner of Archer and 2nd Avenue. Ed rarely got to leave the property and socialize with other children.
His mother, Augusta, is a very domineering character indeed. She is a devout Christian and she has some very extreme ideas about sin and about morality. And she drums into her sons that they're not to socialise with anybody outside of the family because all of the people around them in the local town are sinners, they're evil, all the women are whores. And so she creates this very insular family environment where they're quite isolated from the rest of the community, and that has a really significant impact on them.
Gein seemed to have been very friendless whenever he would make some kind of friend. On those rare occasions, when he would try to make a school friend and bring home a school friend, the mother would immediately find some reason to disapprove of the other child and forbid Ed from ever bringing him home. So he grew up again in a state of complete social isolation.
And Gein's relationship with his father was also far from perfect.
Well, the father, George, was an alcoholic. He appeared to have been somewhat free in his use of physical punishment, but mostly the picture that emerges of George is of, kind of a hapless individual who was, as all 3 male members of the family were, under the thumb of his wife, and again, who was regarded as much as anything else as a sort of obstacle or impediment to the household.
As Ed entered adolescence, his life became even more insular.
He dropped out of school when he was around about 12 or 13 to work on the family's farm, and he was considered to be a bit of an oddball. He was quite a loner, and he enjoyed quite solitary pursuits, so he really quite liked reading and was quite a prolific reader. So he was somebody who didn't really fit in, but worked incredibly hard to keep the family farm going.
On a dark winter's night, officers from the Plainfield Police Department began to search the Gein farm for Bernice Wharton.
They couldn't get into the house, so they went around back and entered into what was called the summer kitchen, which was a little shed outside.
This property didn't have any electricity, so they were pretty much fumbling around in the dark with flashlights, but I don't think they expected to find what they did find there.
One of them turned on his flashlight and beamed it around and saw this object that was hanging from the rafters, which at first they thought was some kind of gutted deer. Although it didn't look like a deer, they realized to their incredible horror that it was a woman's corpse that was hanging by its heels and been completely gutted.
She'd been strung up, essentially, and she was slit from her sternum to her pelvis. So she'd essentially been butchered by Ed. It really was the most grotesque thing that these officers had ever come across.
And they realized they had found the body of Bernice Wharton. And of course, both of them just stumbled out in horror and vomited, at the sight of this thing.
When the news spread across the town, the residents of Plainfield were in complete shock.
When I heard of his arrest, I couldn't believe it. I was sure they had the wrong person because it just didn't seem like anything that they were telling us was the Ed that we all knew. But, yeah, it was a Saturday night. We were at a dance, and the story went through there, and everybody said, "I don't believe it," but it was true.
After finding the butchered body of Bernice Wharton in a shed at Ed Gein's farm, the police officers moved their search into the main house.
He boarded up some areas of the family's home to maintain the rooms as his mother had left them. And in other parts of the property, he just started hoarding things. You know, you would have trash and rubbish build up, and it really became, you know, a complete hovel.
He'd reverse the normal process of trash disposal, you know, and instead of taking all his garbage to the dump, would go to the dump and bring it into his house.
But there was more than just household waste.
Amid all that wreckage, they discovered these incomprehensible, unspeakably awful objects that had been fashioned out of human body parts. There were chairs that were upholstered in human flesh.
There was a lampshade made of human skin. They found the remains of 12 human heads, gloves made out of the skin from a corpse's fingers.
There was a jar containing human noses. There was a box full of female genitalia, some of which had been painted and tied with ribbons. There was a belt fashioned out of female nipples. There was a shade pull made of human lips.
They found all types of things that belonged to people that were no longer people. And it was shocking. I mean, you think of this happening, you know, now, it'd still be shocking. But back then, in a small, tiny rural community, it was absolutely, it was breathtaking.
Ed Gein's farmhouse was the habitation of a literal ghoul. You know, somebody who had been living amidst these horrific relics of human dismemberment. It was a madhouse.
Gein's fascination with death and corpses had been growing ever since his mother had died 12 years previously.
Ed had always enjoyed reading. It was quite a solitary pursuit, so that's not particularly surprising. But after the death of his mother and his brother, he started to read an awful lot more, and his tastes in literature really did span quite a wide spectrum. He read pornographic magazines, he read medical textbooks, and he developed a particular interest in Ilse Koch, who worked at one of the Nazi concentration camps and collected patches of skin of the prisoners who were detained there. And I think all of this was fueling a very active imagination. So he's developing these obsessions and these interests, and he's quite skilled as a farmhand at this point in time. He knows how to slaughter animals, he knows how to prepare carcasses. He's from a community that's very much into its hunting and its fishing. So at some point, reality and fantasy are going to collide.
As the search of the farmhouse progressed, officers found that the grotesque collection of body parts became even more disturbing.
Among the most hideous of all the items were human skin masks that were hanging from the wall of his bedroom, the faces of women that had been flayed from the skulls and that had been preserved. Some of them had lipstick applied to them and that had been hung on the walls as decorations. And then, most notoriously, there was a skin suit that Ed had crafted out of the upper torso of a woman and the leggings of a woman. And apparently, as he later confessed, he would put on this skin suit and put on one of the female skin masks and caper around in his yard, pretending to be his mother.
Gein's macabre collection had been acquired from the very same cemetery where his mother's body lay.
2 years after the death of his mother in 1947, he starts grave robbing. So he's going into a local burial ground, he's digging up bodies, and he's taking things from the bodies. Now, he's not taking jewellery or items of any value, he's actually taking body parts. It really is an absolute house of horrors. So what started off as an interest, which was confined to the pages of a book, has now become a reality behind the doors of this rather bizarre house. So what he's doing in a really grotesque way is trying to bring his mother back to life in some way, shape or form, because he was just so dependent upon her for a sense of his own identity.
And the search wasn't over yet. Officers would soon discover, inside a paper bag in Gein's home, the severed head of a woman who'd been missing from Plainfield for over 2 years. Rodney Alcala was born in San Antonio, Texas, on the 23rd of August, 1943.
He was on the surface, a perfectly normal boy. Didn't kill small animals or do any of those other horrible things that serial killers tend to go on to do. But in 1951, when he was 8, his grandmother, who was ill, decided that she wanted to go back to die in Mexico. And so the whole family left Texas and went to Mexico.
But while living south of the US border, Alcala's father left the family home to start a new life.
The father abandons the family at that point in time and then goes back to live in the US. And I think that's quite a significant thing. I think that Alcala's relationship with his father was quite an important one to him. And I think that's something that stayed with Alcala throughout his life, and I think it does feed into his offending behaviour.
Aged 12, Alcala's mother moved him and his 3 siblings to Los Angeles to start a new life back in the US.
He's popular, he's on the yearbook committee, he plays the piano, he runs for the school, he has girlfriends, he's on the surface an all-American or all-Mexican-American boy.
After graduating from high school, Alcala joined the army. But his time was cut short after a death in the family had a devastating effect on him.
Whilst he's in the army, he has a nervous breakdown, and this is after his father has died. And he's given a medical discharge from the army because he has this nervous breakdown. And then he kind of goes off the radar for a while. So I think this is the period in which he starts perhaps fantasizing. His offending starts to take shape in his mind, if not in reality.
And in September 1968, Alcala committed a horrific crime. He lured an 8-year-old girl into his Hollywood home.
This is the worst nightmare for any parent. Rodney Alcala and people like him are the reason why you can't send your kids walking to school alone. He kidnaps her, he rapes her. A good Samaritan sees her get into his car, and it doesn't look right. And he follows the car to the house, and it doesn't look right. Now, this is 1968, so it's long before cell phones. He finds a payphone, calls it in, the police get there, knock on the door. Rodney shows up naked and says, "Hey, I'll be right with you."
But 25-year-old Alcala wasn't planning on getting caught red-handed.
He runs out the back naked, okay? And the police officer, who's by himself, looks down, and it's one of those situations where it's save this bleeding little girl on the floor who's unconscious and very close to death. She was in a coma for 33 days after this happened. So it's save the little girl or catch the bad guy running out of the back. And he did the right thing. He saved the little girl. But that meant Alcala got away.
It was a horrifically depraved and violent attack on a child that seemingly came out of nowhere.
Where was the motive for that? There was no sexual abuse that we know of in his childhood. There was no antipathy to women. It was an unexpected bolt from the blue.
Alcala decided to run far away from his crimes, 3,000 miles across the US. The description of the potential kidnapper given to a police sketch artist by Robin's friend looked remarkably similar to a known child molester.
This was a big deal media-wise because we had a missing 12-year-old girl, and Alcala's parole officer saw the composite on TV, and he called detectives and said, "You guys need to check out Rodney Alcala. It looks like him. It sounds like him. You got to look at Rodney Alcala." And like 15 minutes after they received that phone call, one of the cops is home, turns on the TV, and sees Alcala on the dating game.
Faction number 1 is a successful photographer. Please welcome Rodney Alcala. Rod, welcome.
and the host introduced the bachelors, and bachelor number 1 was Rodney Alcala. The detective frantically tried to call the police department and let other detectives know that he was on television so that they could turn it on and see him.
Alcala's appearance on the program, where women pick eligible bachelors without seeing their faces, was recorded 10 months earlier in September 1978. On the show that day with Alcala was actor Jed Mills.
The vibes I got from him while we were doing the show and backstage and even during the actual filming were not good vibes. There was something wrong with this guy.
Jed had met Alcala backstage before the recording.
Didn't talk much. We were guys, and he was this rather good-looking, creepy-looking guy, though. He had the weirdest football haircut. Everything was like perfect. The other guy and I were getting along very nicely, and we were talking about this and that, and every now and then this creepy guy would say something, like he had an attitude, because he knew better than everybody else.
When the cameras began rolling, Alcala turned on the charm.
I'm called the Banana, and I look really good.
Can you be a little more descriptive?
Peel me.
On the dating game show, the woman questioner asks each of the eligible bachelors, I'm going to eat you. What food are you? So Alcala, when he gave his answer, says, well, I'm a banana. Unpeel me.
And I said, oh my God, this guy's such a creep.
But it was enough to win him the date.
Well, I like bananas, so I'll take one.
Number 1, bachelor number 1, all right.
On the outside, Alcala appeared to be a charming, good-looking man. But deep inside, he was hiding a dark history. What the viewing public didn't know was that contestant number 1 was a serial killer. By the time he appeared on the show in September 1978, Alcala had already killed 5 women. Over 35 years on, Jed Mills still feels anger towards his fellow contestant.
Thinking back on it, it was very spooky, that I was in a room with this guy. Had I known, I'd have killed him right there. My bare hands, that he was killing women. Horrible, just horrible.
Prior to his national TV appearance, Alcala had already murdered 23-year-old Cornelia Criley in June 1971 in New York. And then in July 1977, he killed another young woman in the city, 23-year-old Ellen Hover. Over the following 12 months, he struck again, this time in Southern California. Among his innocent victims, 18-year-old Jill Barkham, 27-year-old Georgia Wickstead, and 32-year-old Charlotte Lamb. All were murdered by the 34-year-old who was now hiding in plain sight.
Most serial killers, or killers in general, want to avoid detection, want to avoid publicity, want to avoid the spotlight, and this guy was actually seeking it out, which is, an indication of his personality.
He really does love being in the limelight, so I think he would have really enjoyed appearing on that dating show in the 1970s.
Alcala pled guilty to both New York murders, taking his total number of victims to 7. In 2010, over 100 pictures found in Alcala's Seattle storage unit were released into the public domain by detectives in a bid to identify potential victims. As a result, Alcala has since been charged with killing a 28-year-old woman in Wyoming in 1977. Many of the photographs found in the locker were too graphic to be released, meaning many of the women remain unaccounted for.
Alcala may be the most dangerous of all of the killers that have ever been caught, because while he was only charged with a relatively small number of murders, the number of pictures he had means that he may have killed in excess of 100 people.
Given the volume of the photographs, we always knew that we had other victims. We didn't know who they were.
Alcala was forced to pay for some of his crimes, but for the families of the deceased, the pain of losing a loved one is a punishment that lasts forever.
I don't think Robin's family is ever going to be at peace. They had their 12-year-old sister kidnapped and brutally murdered in the mountains of Los Angeles County. They live with that every day when they look at her photographs that they have on their shelves. It tormented them then, and when people bring it up today, it's further torment for them. So I don't think they'll ever be at peace. They'll certainly be elated the day he dies, but at peace, I think they're just dealing with it.
74-year-old Rodney Alcala remains on death row in Corcoran State Prison in California. He has never admitted to any other murders.
Well, if I was to describe Alcala with 3 words, it would be me, me, me. This man is an absolute narcissist, and he doesn't care about the rights or the feelings of other people, and all of his behaviour revolves around him. So he's somebody who was only going to ever pursue his own desires, and unfortunately, this ended up in a lot of people losing their lives.
For these psychopaths, their main thing, they want to control things. They want to be in control, they want the attention on them. That's kind of what drives them. He went up, he made his whole pitch, and they soundly rejected him. They rejected his defense. They rejected everything that he stood for and found that he deserved to die for what he did.
My feelings towards the monster, it's rage, it's anger, and I really hope that he's suffering. He's in poor physical health. He's being fed through a feeding tube. It's reported that he has Alzheimer's. I hope all of this is true, and that one day I get that phone call that he is gone, and nobody will ever have to hear his name again.
Rodney Alcala killed at least 6 women and a 12-year-old girl. He was a terrifying predator hiding behind a charming persona, and attacked his victims for nothing other than his own selfish pleasures. To this day, we still do not know why he did it. When he finally dies, Alcala will be remembered as one of the most dangerous men in America and one of the world's most evil killers. Released after just 5 years in a facility for the criminally insane, Kemper went on a killing spree that targeted young female co-eds.
She was hitchhiking home from school. She was taken out to a remote area where she was shot in the head with a .22 caliber gun.
In all, the vicious serial killer would slaughter 10 people, including his mother. He would typically dismember and sexually desecrate the bodies, making Edmund Kemper one of the world's most evil killers. Kemper lived in Burbank in Southern California with his mother, Clarnell, his father, also called Edmund, and his 2 sisters.
His father was a World War II veteran and had worked on nuclear testing before coming back after the war to work as an electrician. Ed's father used the expression, suicide missions were nothing compared to living with Clarnell. Clarnell was an extraordinary personality. Neurotic, aggressive, alcoholic, and utterly domineering. She terrorized both her husband and her son, favoring the 2 daughters.
In 1957, when Kemper was 9 years old, his parents divorced. His mother took him and his 2 sisters to live with her in Helena, Montana. She would allegedly play havoc with the young boy's psyche.
She demeaned him and she abused him and basically ostracized him and made him feel terrible.
Kemper expresses more than almost any serial killer I've ever heard of, a hatred of his mother that's indescribable.
The young Kemper developed some macabre fascinations.
He would play games with his sisters like gas chamber or electric chair. He would get them to tie himself to a chair, and then he would pretend to be electrocuted.
Afraid that he would harm his sisters, when he was 10, Kemper's mother ordered him to sleep in the basement.
Now, you could have 2 different views of this. One is that it's horribly cruel, and the other is this is a mother who did the only thing she could to protect her daughter. Regardless of the explanation, from Kemper's point of view, it was torture. And he reviled his mother.
Aged 13, young Kemper took off and went to find his father in California.
He goes and he finds his father, but his father doesn't really want to know because he's got a new life now. He has a stepson, he has this new family unit, and Ed feels incredibly rejected by that.
But his mother rejected him too. A year later, she sent the boy, age 14, to live with his paternal grandparents on a farm in North Fork, California. It would be a fatal decision.
His grandmother is very similar to his mother. She's incredibly domineering. She's not particularly nice to him.
Kemper would grow to be an imposing physical figure. At 15, he already stood 6 foot 4 inches tall.
He grew to 6'9", weighed 21 stone, 300 pounds. He was, in a way, almost a Frankenstein figure.
Tragically, the die was cast and the powerful teen was about to strike with a monstrous rage. On August the 27th, 1964, a 15-year-old Kemper would kill for the first time.
His grandmother is sitting at the kitchen table. Without really any warning, Kemper goes and fetches a rifle, which is in the house, and shoots her. In fact, he shoots her twice, just to make sure she's dead. Then he sits down at the kitchen table opposite the body of his grandmother and waits for his grandfather, and he shoots him too.
Then, in a bizarre twist, Kemper made a surprising move.
Immediately after he killed his grandparents, he calls his mother and he says, "I've killed my grandparents." And she tells him, "Well, you stupid boy, just call the police and wait there until they arrive."
And he sits there waiting for the police. He doesn't run, he doesn't do anything. And when they get there and explain, he said, "Well, I wanted to find out what it felt like to kill grandmother."
Arrested and diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, Kemper was incarcerated in the Atascadero State Hospital in California. In the high-security facility for the criminally insane, Kemper seemed to have found peace. On May the 7th, 1972, Kemper's trial runs were over. On that day, Kemper picked up 2 young students in Berkeley, Mary Ann Pesky and Anita Mary Lucchesa, both aged 18. They wanted a ride to Stanford University, about 40 miles away.
Kemper's modus operandi, his MO, was pretty straightforward. He would drive around, he would look for hitchhikers, vulnerable, available. They had to have the characteristics which reminded him of his mother, desirable, and then he would offer them a ride.
These were co-ed girls. These were girls that were in college. They had their entire lives ahead of them. They were happy. And for him, this represented what he didn't have. These would often be girls that would reject him, and he couldn't have relationships with them, but he still wanted them. So this was his way of actually getting access to these women.
Kemper drove the 2 young women to some secluded woods. The big 300-pound man then got them out of the car and handcuffed both of them. Kemper then put one of the women, still alive, in the trunk of the car while he killed her friend.
Often he'll say to them, "I'm not going to kill you," in order to placate them and make sure that they don't make a fuss and try and run away. And then he does murder them, and then he has sex with their dead bodies.
Kemper stabbed, then suffocated each girl in turn to death. He then put the bodies in the trunk of his Ford Galaxy and took them home to the apartment he'd now rented near to Santa Cruz University. There, he dismembered the bodies and gratified himself with the lifeless corpses.
The horrifying aspect of Kemper now is that his sexuality is completely deformed. He cannot effectively operate sexually. if the woman is alive.
The only reason that he's not raping them before he kills them is that he doesn't want to be rejected by them. When you're having sex with the dead body, it's not going to reject you, it's not going to insult you or demean you in the same way that his mother had insulted or demeaned him.
Kemper then stashed the body parts in plastic bags and stored some bits in his home and others in the trunk of his car.
This is something that's known as partialism. It's a sexual arousal through keeping body parts. And I think for Kemper, this is his way of staying close to his victims, of owning them and possessing them and literally carrying a part of them with him.
Kemper would later dump the violated body parts. The local police arrived to arrest the man who had just confessed to being the notorious co-ed killer.
Kemper takes up the entire phone booth. They get him into custody, put a hold on him, and the story now starts to get filled in and unraveled. We sent the district attorney, a district attorney investigator, and my partner, Detective Alufi. They flew to Colorado, rented a station wagon, and the four of them took 3 days to drive back to California. They started out by saying, "Ed, can you tell us how all this started?" And he sat there like I am sitting here. And he said, "On such and such a date and such a time, I was in Berkeley, California. Kemper connects every dot to every single case. He was so precise, we were able to link the evidence to his statements to the crime scenes."
According to some analysts, after killing his mother, Kemper had lost his murderous purpose.
He said later, "I started feeling the folly of the whole damn thing." But he said, and I think more tellingly, the original purpose was gone. And that was, of course, Clarnell.
Given how dysfunctional Kemper's relationship with his mother was, I think that perhaps had it been different, then Ed Kemper maybe wouldn't have gone on to kill all of the people that he did. So I think that Kemper's mother, she started writing the story of the serial killer, but Kemper finished that.
On May the 7th, 1973, Kemper was indicted for the 8 murders he had confessed to. His trial began 5 months later, on October the 23rd that year. But there was a twist in the case.
Edmund Kemper pleaded not guilty. He had a great law team. They hired one of the best forensic psychiatrists in California, if not the United States. I gotta say, they put on a great defense.
He's all too aware that actually life in a state mental hospital is more favourable than life in prison. So he's making quite a calculated decision here to plead insanity, but he wasn't fooling anyone at this point in time.
It's not our first rodeo. I've been to court 1,000 times. You know what's coming. You know how a case is going to be attacked. On the prosecution side, we just keep putting the evidence in front of the jury. How it connects to Edmund Kemper. It came down to really his state of mind.
After just 5 hours of deliberation, on November the 8th, 1973, the jury declared Edmund Kemper sane and found him guilty of first-degree murder on all 8 counts. Downs was having a relationship with a married man, a fellow colleague at the US Post Office where she worked.
Diane Downs said she was in love with this man. This was the man she wanted to be with. She thought that by eliminating the children, that would be the last hurdle she would have to jump over to be able to be with this man forever.
Downs had decided that he was the most important person in her life, bar none.
Here we've got a mother who relentlessly pursued her own wants and desires and really didn't care about her children.
I suspect she's a classic example of a narcissistic killer. The only thing she thinks about is herself. Her children exist in the world for her. She doesn't exist in the world for her children. And her life history suggests that is true. This was a way to change her life. This was a way to get a new boyfriend, the boyfriend she wanted. And that meant so much to her that it was more important to her than the life of her children.
This killer's story begins over 60 years ago. Diane Downs was born on August the 7th, 1955, in Phoenix, Arizona.
You know, there's little to indicate that there was anything especially abnormal about her family life.
Her father was a postal worker and her mum was a stay-at-home mother. Her father was quite the disciplinarian. He had some quite strict rules. He would often give lectures to his children about how to behave, but it was very much a stereotypical American nuclear family.
As a teenager, Diane met Stephen Downs while in high school, and they became a couple. When she was 17, Diane enrolled in Bible college in Orange, California. But soon problems began to brew.
Diane had gone to Bible college, but that hadn't lasted very long. She was only there for 2 semesters, and she was kicked out of college because of, quote, her promiscuous behavior. And that's a theme that we see throughout her life.
After her expulsion, Diane returned to her parents' home in Arizona and married Stephen Downs.
They got married when she was 18. Now, she was very quick to want to start a family, and they soon had their child.
Their first daughter, Christy, was born in October 1974. Just over a year later, Diane had her second child, a girl she named Cheryl.
Diane and her husband had 2 children together, and after this, her husband decides that's it, enough, our family's complete, and he goes and has a vasectomy. But Diane is absolutely adamant she wants another child, so she goes and has a short-term affair with another man and becomes pregnant with her son, Danny.
I suspect that she engaged in what I call instrumental sex. And what I mean by this is, for some women, sex is a tool. It's a weapon. They want to get pregnant because they believe that that will create a relationship.
Diane seemed to really enjoy the pregnancy stage of motherhood, but when the baby actually arrived, she didn't quite like that so much. There are lots of reports that she left the children alone, she left them unattended. When they got home from school, they were waiting on the porch for hours at a time.
In 1980, Diane and her husband Stephen divorced. Soon after, Downs was pregnant again. That's because she'd volunteered to be a surrogate mother.
At the time in the United States, there were approximately 100 surrogate mothers in the entire country. Now, those are the estimates at the time. So being a surrogate mom put you in a very rarefied piece of air. You were unique.
And she was actually interviewed for a national newspaper in the early 1980s, and she very much seemed to enjoy that experience. So she's got a taste of that limelight, and she will use her role as a woman, her role as a mother, as a way to get people to look at her.
The thing that we need to understand about these crimes is that because she's driving down the street with a loaded gun, which means before she stepped into that car, she knew she was going to kill her children.
In keeping with her pernicious plan, after leaving the farm, Diane Downs packed the children in the car and drove to a carefully chosen site on Old Mohawk Road. She pulled over and got out of the car.
We are talking about a premeditated homicide. This is something that the average person thinks of as inconceivable and impossible.
With the children not suspecting a thing, she went to the trunk of the car. She pulled out a Ruger .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol, walked back to the driver's side with the gun in hand.
When the children first see the gun, they have to be in total disbelief. It has to be inconsistent with all of their experiences.
Then she knelt on the seat, leaned forward towards her daughter, 7-year-old Cheryl, and from about 6 inches away, fired. On the case on the night of the attack was forensic expert Jim Pex.
One shot was in the back that exited about at the sternum, and that was probably the bullet that was found in the passenger side, inside the vehicle.
As Cheryl tried to exit the car, her mother leant out of the passenger side door and fired again.
There was another shot in the lower torso here that stayed in her.
After the first bullet is fired, the second and third bullets are fired within seconds. But when a gun is fired in a closed space like a car, it is very loud. I mean, it is booming, shocking, on its own is stunning, and for children more so.
Next down shot her 3-year-old son in the back.
The boy was on the driver's side back seat, had a single wound, gunshot wound to the spine.
She then shot her daughter Christy in the chest twice. As the girl raised her hand to defend herself, a bullet ripped through the thumb of her left hand.
There was a bullet penetrating wound that went through her hand, exited near the thumb, and then into her chest.
In the back of the car, Christy and Danny were clinging to life. Lying in the footwell in the front, Cheryl was mortally wounded.
I suspect that Diane Downs chose to shoot her children because it's placing distance mentally and physically between her and them. It's a cold, calculated decision. You don't have to be staring into somebody's eyes to do it.
It was a clinical and cruel attack, but Downs' evil plan was far from over. While her children lay dying, Diane Downs continued with her coldly conceived plan and covered her tracks.
Not only did she know she was going to kill her children, she knew that she was going to have to, in order to make it look like somebody else did it, she was going to have to shoot herself.
So she shot herself and
Jim Pex placed 2 .22 caliber bullets side by side under a comparison microscope. One ejected by Downs' rifle and the other one that was found inside the crime scene car.
What you have is a split image down the middle, and what we're looking at are extractor marks. And as you can see by the fine striations here, these extractor marks were both made by the same extractor, which means there is a relationship between the cartridge casings from the crime scene and the cartridges from her apartment. Then we knew that this is a breakthrough moment where there is a relationship to the fired casings that hit the children to the cartridges that were inside the tubular magazine of the rifle.
Checking sales records, police knew that Diane Downs had owned a Ruger .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. After test firing one exhaustively, Jim Pex found similar extractor marks on the bullet casings. He concluded that a Ruger .22 caliber pistol was the murder weapon, but it was never found.
while Diane Downs managed to dispose of the gun, but at home she had a rifle that also shot .22 caliber rounds. And when the police processed this evidence, they found that they were the same manufacturer as the bullets that were used to shoot her children. They had ejector marks on them, some of them, that were the same as the ejector marks from the pistol.
The bullet casings and their telltale extractor marks were enough to convict Diane Downs for the murder and attempted murder of her 3 children. On February the 28th, 1984, 9 months after the crime, she was brought into custody.
When the arrest finally went down, I think the whole town breathed a sigh of relief.
She appeared at the Lane County Courthouse for her arraignment. After the charges were read, Diane Downs sprung a major surprise.
Her attorney stands up, and after he's finished all the legal arguments, says, and besides, Your Honor, my client is pregnant and it would be bad for her health to go to jail. I was sitting in that courtroom in a seat. You could hear the entire room take a big, deep breath. It was stunning, just absolutely stunning.
According to rumors, the father was a local reporter.
There was one reporter that had sex with her, and I can tell you this, it wasn't me. And she became pregnant from that. But she loved the attention that she got.
By the time the trial began on May the 8th, 1984, Downs was 8 months pregnant.
Obviously, she was pregnant at the time of the trial, and this was something that I think she thought would help her garner quite a bit of sympathy.
Her antics, however, were not enough to fool the jury. A mountain of evidence went a long way to convincing them of Diane Downs's culpability in the crime. Then her surviving daughter, Christy, took to the stand.
This little girl had to have been under so much strain and stress. Her mother's tried to kill her. She's living with a new family. Her sister is dead. Her brother's in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. And now she has to sit in front of a room full of strangers and talk about the most difficult night of her life.
She gets up on the stand, and when the person asks her the question, who shot you and your siblings, she says, my mum did it.
This was one of those moments in court where everything is dead still, nobody dares breathe.
Christy laid out how her mother first shot Cheryl, then turned and shot Danny in the back, then shot her twice in the chest.
The testimony just tore your heart apart. This wasn't the critical piece of information. There was lots of physical evidence of what Diane Downs had done. But I think this was essential in making sure that Diane Downs was convicted of the crime she committed.
On June the 17th, 1984, the jury found Diane Downs guilty of the murder of her 7-year-old daughter Cheryl and the attempted murder of her daughter Christy and son Danny. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. 10 days after she was found guilty, Diane gave birth to a baby girl. The child was immediately given up for adoption. At the same time, the prosecutor in the case, Fred Hughey, adopted the 2 children who survived their mother's attack. A serial killer the press dubbed
That they don't know who's coming into their home, which is their place of sanctuary, and attacking them in the most brutal way. It really is terror of an unimaginable degree.
Former State Attorney Rod Smith had never encountered a case featuring such depravity.
I have no way to measure comparative evil, but certainly he was a guy whose crimes were, for this community and in this part of the world, were among the most tragic and horrific.
This killer's story begins in 1954. Danny Harold Rolling was born in Shreveport, Louisiana on May the 26th. His 20-year-old mother fell pregnant almost immediately after the couple married, much to his father's disgust.
Danny Rolling was the son of a policeman, but he wasn't a very compassionate policeman. In fact, he was a violent and abusive father.
For the rest of Danny's life, his father would refer to him as an accident that should never have happened. He had a violent temper, and almost anything young Danny did was able to ignite it.
If he didn't breathe properly, he was beaten by his father, that the slightest thing would set him off. And I think if we look at that now, we'd call that coercive control now. We'd call that the kind of behaviour that is designed to chip away at somebody's self-esteem, that really does destroy someone's identity.
Time after time throughout his childhood, Rolling was told by his supremely arrogant father that he was useless. It was a useless piece of work and never would amount to anything.
15 months later, Rolling's mother would fall pregnant again and gave birth to her second son. she would continually try to protect the two boys from their father's destructive influence.
His mother flees several times, taking him and his younger brother. They get away from his abusive, domineering father, but she soon goes back to the home. So you've got this constant toing and froing, this constant state of upheaval, and this creates an environment that isn't safe, that isn't secure.
To add to Rowling's insecurity, his mother, his only form of stability, was struggling with mental health issues. Despite him needing her, she wasn't always around. Still a young child, Rowling's existence became a solitary one. He would hide in the woods or wander the neighborhood to escape the constant abuse from his father.
He would go out at night when his parents didn't know about it, and he would look through the windows of the neighbours' homes and he'd see them around the kitchen table, around the dinner table, happy families all together. And he's got that building resentment. Why have these people got this when I haven't? What's wrong with me? And that's something that continues to bubble away in the background.
Rowling yearned for a normal family, the kind of home life that everyone else appeared to have. The suffering at the hands of his father, coupled with his mother's mental instability, sent him on a downward spiral.
Now, the impact this had on quite a suggestible child was severe. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that Rowling's father made Rowling into a serial killer, but there was no doubt at all that there was a very great deal of animosity between father and son.
As a teenager, Rowling continued to escape his home life. He spent even more time wandering the neighborhood, and around the age of 13, his innocent childhood pastime of watching families became sexually motivated.
Rowling had a habit of stalking people, and he would watch them. That voyeurism that had developed during his early years, when he'd looked through the windows of the happy families in his neighbourhood and had that simmering resentment, turned into something else. It turned into something quite sinister.
Rowling took a particular interest in watching young women. He was caught several times and began to get a reputation as a
He is just a pot of simmering resentment, and it's no surprise to me that he takes it out on people who he wants to be like, people who he feels envious of.
En route to Gainesville, Rowling's trip included a stop in Florida's state capital, Tallahassee.
He got off at the bus station in Tallahassee and clearly had already made plans as to what he was going to do. He bought a K-bar knife there at an Army-Navy store right there by the bus station.
Armed with his K-bar combat knife, once he arrived in Gainesville, Rowling set up a makeshift camp in the woods.
He was a vagrant, a bum, if you like, but he had a purpose. And his purpose was a very particular kind of victim.
Danny primarily targeted young women, and they were always young brunettes like his former wife had been. I was always struck by the fact that, for the most part, his victims were of a type.
On the 23rd of August 1990, new roommates Christina Powell and Sonia Larson were preparing for the beginning of the fall semester at the University of Florida.
They're 17 and 18 years old. They're freshmen. This is the start of an exciting period in their lives.
Someone else was enjoying their excitement too. That evening, they caught the attention of Danny Rowling.
And he's watching them through the window. He can see them giggling along together, having a nice time, washing the dishes. You can just imagine the kind of conversations they're having about the things they're excited about at university.
Rowling has been watching them. In fact, he's probably spent the best part of the night outside in the woods just behind the apartment block. In the early hours, he breaks in. He used very specific equipment, a screwdriver to get in through a sliding door that most of these girls had, and a K-bar knife, which he also used. Those two elements were his signature.
Rowling found Christina asleep on the couch downstairs and Sonia in bed upstairs.
So he's decided that Christina is the one that he wants. So he gets Sonia out of the way first.
He leaves Christina Powell asleep on the couch and creeps upstairs and attacks Sonia Larson while she's asleep. He puts duct tape over her mouth to prevent her screaming, and also, of course, to prevent her waking up Christina, who's asleep downstairs.
Rolling stabbed Sonia repeatedly until she was dead. He then made his way back downstairs to Christina, who was still asleep on the couch.
He wakes her, puts duct tape.
He wanted to buy the gun, sold it to him for cash. And the agent asked him, well, was there anything that stood out about this guy, anything that you can remember that would help us identify who he was?
Officers were told the gun had been sold to a vagrant who had a very distinctive attribute.
We were in a task force meeting one morning, and I started recalling what this FBI agent had reported, that the individual, the gun used in the bank robbery had been sold to an individual who had a missing finger, and one of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement agents stood up and says, "Holy shit." And the whole room falls silent. And he proceeds to explain that during the crime scene investigation of the first murders of Christina Powell and Sonia Larson, that they found a piece of paper towel on the counter in the kitchen. On one side was the imprint of a man's penis, as if he were wiping himself off after conducting a sex act. On the other side of the paper was a handprint with a finger missing. And it was at that point that everybody realized the bank robber is the murderer. The problem is, we still didn't know who that was.
Once that connection had been made, the crime lab began re-examining other exhibits from the Woodland campsite in connection with the student murders.
Among the elements of significance were a ski mask whose fibers matched the duct tape found at the third murder. Krista Hoyt's pubic hairs were found on Ronning's sleeping bag at the campsite. Blood on a pair of his trousers was found to be Manny Taboda's. A screwdriver was found which matched the marks on the sliding doors by which he got into the apartments. But the most significant, perhaps of all, was there was a series of audio tapes.
In these disturbing recordings, Rolling alluded to the horror that he was about to unleash.
I know I'll have to run the rest of my life, but I'm getting pretty good at it. I'm a big boy. I can take care of myself. We're all down here for just a breath anyway. Well, I'm going to sign off for a little bit, but that's something I got to do.
As more details of the Gainesville killings emerged, police in Shreveport, Louisiana, realized that there were significant similarities between these cases and the unsolved murders of the Grissom family in 1989. They suspected all 8 homicides may be connected, but the identity of this serial killer remained a mystery.
After a period of time when it became evident that the murderer had either left Florida or had been arrested because no further murders had been committed that matched that MO, a decision was made to test the DNA of all inmates in Florida who had been arrested between, I think it was like a 3 or a 4 month window. Anybody who had been arrested during that time frame was going to have their DNA checked against the DNA on the homicides.
Danny Rolling was in jail pending the trial for the armed robbery of the grocery store in nearby Ocala. So he was on the list to have his DNA checked against the killers. He also had a partially missing finger on his left hand.
They obtain his profile, and lo and behold, they match and they've got their man.
On the 24th of January 1991, as a result of DNA testing, Rolling became the prime suspect in the Gainesville student murders. Brian Jarvis was a sergeant covering major crimes in Marion County, where Rolling was brought in for questioning in connection with the murders.
When Danny walked into the interview room, he was shackled. He had a lot of anxiety. His left leg would tap, it would shuffle. He would be scratching his leg or picking lint off of it. In fact, there was 1 or 2 points there where the detective offered to show him.
Whitehaven, northwest England. On the 2nd of June 2010, a lone gunman embarked on a deadly killing spree that rocked the nation. Shooting many of his victims at close range, 52-year-old taxi driver Derrick Bird even murdered his own brother.
Bird's shooting spree effectively occupied only about 12 hours. And the impact was extraordinary because this was in the days, of course, of rolling news, of 24-hour news channels. As it unfolded, and as Bird became more and more obsessed by killing anybody who came across, so it became ever more dramatic.
Most of Bird's victims were completely random targets.
People delivering catalogues, people taking their shopping home, people just going about their day-to-day business. And I think it emphasises for me how fragile life is, especially when you encounter somebody like Derrick Bird, who has nothing to lose.
Derrick Bird killed 12 people, injured a further 11, and then turned the gun on himself. After his death, his family released a statement to the press via the local vicar.
He was a loving dad and recently became a grandfather. We would like to say that we do not know why our dad committed these horrific crimes. We are both mortified by the sad events.
This killer's story begins in 1957. Derrick and his twin brother were born on the 27th of November in Ennerdale Bridge, a village a few miles out of Whitehaven, to a seemingly ordinary family. The twins had an older brother, and their father worked nearby for the local council. The twins went to a school in Whitehaven. Despite being older by only 5 minutes, Derrick seemed to be in the shadow of his younger twin brother, David.
It's always assumed, isn't it, that twins will adore each other. You know, there are many twins that are like that, but in this particular case, I don't think they were. I think they were rather isolated from one another. David was probably the more likeable one, Derrick the quieter one. He was kind of a bit of a loner.
As the brothers grew up, the differences between them became more apparent.
David was his twin brother, but that was where any resemblance ended, I think. David was better at sports. He was on the rugby team at school. Derrick wasn't a particularly athletic child. David was cleverer, he was more handsome, he was more successful, and many people have described Derrick as living in David's shadow. And this isn't anything unusual. Many siblings are outshone by others in their family, but they don't carry the kind of rage and the kind of resentment that Derrick Bird did. I think because that was what his personality was. He really did catastrophize this relationship with his brother, and he blamed him for so many things.
Despite where he would visit shooting ranges, he owned several guns, and in March 2007, he purchased a new .22 caliber rifle.
There's no doubt that he had a great interest in guns, which I think had been given to him by his father. He had a shotgun license for many years in 1974. He had a proper license for a .22 caliber rifle, complete with a silencer. He had a license to have quite a lot of ammunition.
Bird loved shooting. It was very much a solitary pursuit. He had very little in common with his fellow taxi drivers in Whitehaven. In February 2008, his taxi was vandalized, and he suspected one of them.
There is often quite a bit of banter between taxi drivers, and sometimes this can turn quite nasty, especially when there are disputes over fares, whether somebody has picked up somebody else's passenger, because this is how these guys make their living. But for Derrick Bird, he attaches an awful lot of significance to this because he has this permanent exclusion narrative. Everybody is out to get me. Everybody is against me. And I think this does add to that.
Money was tight for Bird, and he became increasingly paranoid about it.
When Derrick Bird's father had died, there was an argument about the will and who was to get what in the will. Bird felt that his twin brother and the family solicitor were planning to reveal to the tax authorities who were examining Bird's affairs at that time that he had a secret bank account in which there was £60,000. He was convinced that the world, his brother, his solicitor, and every other taxi driver was against him. And then added on top of that, a little fuel that everyone was against him.
Bird also discovered that his father had lent his twin brother David money before he died.
Derrick found out that his father made an unspoken secret loan to David. Even at the point where he's the person, you know, taking over and being responsible for the welfare of his mother, David is getting the money, feeling disinherited and believing, as he did, that his brother and his accountant were plotting against him to get him jailed for tax fraud were just too much for him.
He was of the view that his brother and his solicitor had conspired against him. He felt very bitter about a £25,000 loan that his father had made to his twin brother back in 1998. So this is somebody who really does hang on to grudges. He collects them, he stores them away. He doesn't deal with those issues with that anger, and it all boils and boils and boils away.
He was a man who was rapidly going nowhere, was finding himself alone. The frustration was simply too much for him.
Alienated from everyone and increasingly annoyed that his twin brother may have benefited from his father's death, Derrick Bird had finally had enough and came to a fateful decision. Full of rage and armed with his rifle, in the early hours of June the 2nd, he drove to his brother's house in Lamplugh.
Derrick Bird arrives in his brother David's house with his silenced .22 caliber rifle and confronts him sometime in the early hours. I can only imagine that brother would have been utterly bewildered. Suddenly his brother appears in the middle of the night, wakes him up. Bird proceeds, without any warning, to shoot his brother. Not once or twice, but 11 times in the head and the body.
This was a really, really cowardly act. He's caught his brother at the time when he's most vulnerable. It wasn't just an intention to kill, it was an intention to completely destroy. So shooting somebody 11 times, that's way more violence than you need to get the job done. So I think this does show the intensity of the resentment that Bird felt towards his brother.
For him, it was a cathartic release. Remember, this isn't just a brother from his point of view that cheated him out of some inheritance, you know, late in life. This is a brother who was the person to whom he was compared for his whole life and compared unfavorably. So this was the final act of justice from his point of view.
Having shot his twin brother dead, Derrick Bird then left David's house and made his way to the home of 60-year-old Kevin Commons.
Just after 5 o'clock that morning, Derrick Bird drives to the house of his solicitor, Kevin Commons, and he hangs around waiting for him for around about 4 hours. So for me, this is really significant because it's showing that Bird has a rage that is not dissipating. I think when most people are angry and they don't have an outlet for that anger, it does fizzle away and people calm down, people feel better, but not Derrick Bird.
Several dog walkers saw Bird outside Kevin Commons' farmhouse in the village of Frissington. He waited there for several hours, planning his next deadly move.
Around about 10 o'clock that morning, Kevin Commons drives up his driveway, sees Derrick Bird blocking him in and probably wonders what on earth is going on. He's not given long to process that thinking until Bird comes out and shoots him twice. He must be absolutely shocked. You know, what on earth is he doing? So he's just basically trying to survive at this point in time. He hasn't killed him. So he stumbles to his feet. He starts to crawl away, to go back towards his house.
A neighbour heard the gunshots and saw Kevin Commons trying to flee.
Bird follows him, but replaces the shotgun with the rifle and proceeds to shoot him twice more, killing him at the spot.
Just after 10 a.m., the concerned neighbors called the police, who discovered Kevin's body in his driveway. But Bird was nowhere to be seen. He'd fled the scene in his car, armed with 2 weapons, a 12-gauge sawed-off shotgun and a .22 caliber rifle.
Shotguns and rifles are very different weapons. A rifle is designed to send a stable projectile a long distance. A shotgun is designed to spread pellets out. A rifle certainly can fire a small projectile.
The net is closing in around him. He then starts to crash into vehicles. You can imagine by now his grasp of reality is distorted, to put it politely. He bangs into vehicles. He damages the tyres of his taxi. Eventually, so badly that one deflates completely, crashes into a wall.
Bird was now running out of petrol. With no ammunition and his car damaged, he drove to a beauty spot near Boot called Dr. Bridge.
He'd run out of shotgun bullets, and suddenly he realized that, unlike his hyperbolic fantasies before this, life as he knew it was really over.
At approximately 12:30 p.m., police found Bird's car abandoned with one of his guns inside. Bird was now on foot, armed with his rifle. With the public still at high risk, the police had now taken the decision to name Derrick Bird as their prime suspect, but there was still no sign of him. Then, at approximately 1:30 p.m., police officers found Derrick Bird's body in a wooded area near Boot. He'd shot himself.
He'd engaged in the ultimate failure act. There was no reason